Good morning everyone. So this week we're going to be outlining and evaluating the biological approach, and this should fit in quite nicely with the biopsychology that we've been doing for the last month or so. Now last week when we did the cognitive approach, some of you have found that first question which I set a little bit challenging, where it asked about the assumptions. So this week what I'm going to do is go through the assumptions much more explicitly, and hopefully that will clear things up a little bit for you. So the assumptions of the biological approach is that all behaviour can be explained by biological factors, and the three biological factors which you need to be aware of are the influence of our genes, the influence of our brain structures, and the influence of our neurochemistry. So that's mostly our neurotransmitters, but hormones are relevant there as well. And the biological approach also assumes that we can study these biological processes scientifically, so it's a very scientific approach. Just to put that into context of the other approaches, so the assumption of the behavioural approach is that all behaviour is caused by learning through our direct experiences, so operant and classical conditioning. The social learning approach assumes that behaviour is caused by learning through the observation of other people and vicarious reinforcement. The cognitive approach that we looked at last week assumes that behaviour is caused by thoughts and other mental processes. And the psychodynamic approach, which we did with Miss Smith, assumes that our behaviour is caused by subconscious drives and early childhood experiences, so that both those things make up the subconsciousness. And like I said, the biological approach assumes that biological factors are what cause our behaviour. So to start off with, what is a gene? So genes are small sections of DNA, and they code for proteins, and this allows them to contain the instructions for our individual and unique characteristics. So there are two key terms you need to know about when we're talking about genetics. The first is genotype. So a person's genotype is the specific genetic makeup of an individual. It's a collection of all of their genes. And phenotype is the way that those genes are expressed, so that their eye colour, their levels of aggression, schizophrenia. And just to help you kind of understand the difference between these two, if you have identical twins, they are 100% genetically similar, so they have the exact same genotype. However, one twin might spend all their time sitting in bed all day and playing video games, where the other twin might spend all their time working out in the gym. So even though they have the exact same genes, one of them is more likely to be quite fit and strong, where the other one wouldn't be. So they would look different in spite of their exact similar genotype. Their phenotype would be different though. So the influence of genes on behaviour can be seen in a few different topics that you've already covered. So different people sometimes have different versions of the same gene, and these different versions are called alleles. So we all have two alleles of a gene, one from our mother, one from our father, because all of our genes are in pairs. So for example, one allele that you've looked at is the SERT gene, which you looked at in psychopathology when you were studying OCD. So SERT just stands for serotonin transporter, because this gene codes for a serotonin transporter protein, which is one of the proteins which reabsorbs serotonin into the presynaptic neuron after it's been released. So you can see here in this flowchart how it can lead to different behaviours depending on the allele you have. So the first SERT allele causes normal levels of serotonin reabsorption into the presynaptic neuron. This means you have healthy levels of serotonin activity and you don't present any kind of psychological disorders. However, if you have SERT allele 2, this would increase the levels of serotonin reabsorption, which means that you have lower levels of serotonin activity in the synaptic gap. And because there's lower levels of serotonin activity, we find that we're more likely to see those OCD-like symptoms, or depression symptoms actually as well, but you learned about OCD symptoms in your psychopathology module. So one way we can look at this is through twin studies. So twin studies basically compare a pair of twins for a specific behaviour. So monozygotic twins, or MZ twins, are also called identical twins, and they share 100% of their genes. Dizygotic twins, or DZ twins, more commonly known as fraternal twins or non-identical twins, only share 50% of their genes. So, seeing as monozygotic twins share double the genes, we would expect the concordance rate to be twice as high compared to dizygotic twins for a behaviour, if that behaviour has a genetic basis. But the problem with the twin study is that, as you can see here, monozygotic twins may be treated more similarly than dizygotic twins. So you can see here, these monozygotic identical twins are being dressed in the exact same clothing, which means they might be treated very similarly compared to these non-identical twins who have different clothes, although they do look very similar. So if monozygotic twins have a higher concordance rate than the dizygotic twins, this might actually just be because the monozygotic twins have a more similar environment, instead of just because they have a greater genetic similarity. And even if it's not just because of the environment, we still might see that the similarity between their environments has an impact on the concordance rate, which is something we need to try and disentangle. And the way that we can do that is through adoption studies. So an adoption study is where we look at an adopted child and we compare the concordance rate between that child and their biological parents, and we compare it to their adoptive parents. And the benefit of this is that it separates the genes from the environment, because we use children who were adopted from a very, very young age, so when they were infants, below like 1. So the concordance rate between the adopted child here and their biological parents is only going to be a result of the genetic similarity between these two. So any concordance rate between these two has to be because of genes. It cannot be because of upbringing, i.e. environment. On the other hand, the concordance rate between the adopted child and their adoptive parents cannot be due to genetics, because they have no genetic similarity in common. So therefore the concordance rate between these two must be because of the shared environment. So if we have a concordance rate here of about 50% and a concordance rate here of about 3%, then we can conclude that a behaviour must be genetically based. So, like I said, you also need to know about brain structures, but we've covered that quite extensively in biopsychology, so I'm not going to go into it in tremendous depth again now. So basically, we know through our studies on localization of function that different brain regions are responsible for our ability to carry out certain behaviours, or at least that's one of the assumptions of the biological approach. So for example, Broca's area is responsible for our ability to produce speech. So producing speech is the behaviour, and the biological cause is that Broca's area becomes active. And similarly, when you looked at OCD, activity in the orbitofrontal cortex and the caudate nucleus, which are two components of the worry circuit that you would have looked at, may cause the obsessions component of OCD. So if you remember, the orbitofrontal cortex sends worry signals about something, and the caudate nucleus then suppresses that signal once the worry has been dealt with. So if the caudate nucleus, so this brain structure, isn't working as it should do, the worries don't get suppressed, which then leads to the obsession component of obsessive compulsive disorder. And obviously we can study the role of brain structures in behaviour by using any of the neuroimaging techniques that you learned about in biopsychology. So finally, neurochemistry. Our behaviour is obviously influenced by different levels of neurotransmitters and hormones in the body. So for example, low levels of serotonin are linked with depression, and high levels of testosterone are actually also linked with aggression. So here we have a neurotransmitter which is linked with a disorder, and here we have a hormone which is linked with a specific behaviour as well. Now, the way we study neurochemistry is interesting. So often what we do is we study it indirectly. So what we'll do is we assume that if a drug which increases a certain neurotransmitter causes a change in behaviour, then those behaviours are linked to the neurotransmitter. So for example, if we give somebody a drug which increases their serotonin levels and this reduces depression symptoms, then we would assume that depression must be caused by the low levels of serotonin, because increasing serotonin got rid of the depression. However, the problem here is that this isn't necessarily true. So if I have a headache, I go and take some paracetamol and my headache goes away. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I can assume my headache was caused by a lack of paracetamol, because we know that's obviously not true. And the same could be said for serotonin and depression. Just because serotonin reduces our depression symptoms doesn't actually mean depression was caused by a lack of serotonin. And this assumption that a successful treatment is evidence for the underlying cause is actually called the treatment etiology fallacy. So this means that we're fallaciously or wrongly assuming that our treatment allows us to understand the cause. Etiology just means cause. So it's obviously not specific to depression and serotonin. It also applies to a multitude of other things. So for example, people used to take lithium as a treatment for schizophrenia, and that was effective. It reduced schizophrenic symptoms. That doesn't mean we can assume that schizophrenia is caused by a lack of lithium, is another example of this treatment etiology fallacy. Okay, so what I'd like you to do this week is complete the questions which I've uploaded to Google Classroom. There's only a few. It should take you about 15 minutes tops because they're quite short questions. I haven't set any longer ones. And what I'd also like you to do is look through the evaluation yourself. So I will post the page number from the Green Hair Girl book, and I'll also post some online resources for you to have a look. And what I'd like you to do is use those resources to find 2 evaluation points and write out a PEE style paragraph evaluating the biological approach. And the reason I'd like you to do that is because obviously we need to work on our exam technique, and writing these PEE evaluation paragraphs is a really important skill for us to have. Okay, thank you very much everyone, and I hope you enjoy your week.